We all know it's coming. We all know the Switch will die and something new will replace it. But after years of speculation of Switch Pros and Switch 2s and 10-year life cycles for the Nintendo Switch, we really don't know the future. Are we in the middle of a seamless evolution towards the future, or in the last days before the next Nintendo revolution? Here at Nintendo Forecast, the channel for research, measurable, accountable forecasts of the world's least predictable video game company, we're going to investigate. This series is all about building a picture of everything this console could be, considering what it should be, and making some definitive forecasts about what it will be. From timings and pricings to new features, we'll look at it all. We'll look at features including a couple of strong possibilities I haven't seen anyone discussing yet. This is a Nintendo Forecast Deep Dive. Almost never has a console's demise been so heavily trailed as the Nintendo Switch. Whether it's the Switch 2 or the Switch Pro, the mortality of our beloved system has never been in question. But let's just take a moment to reflect on the longevity of the Switch itself. What have Nintendo said? And looking back into the past, what have Nintendo done? What are the pressures acting on the company today, and how could we forecast the Switch's future? After all, this isn't Nintendo's first rodeo. They've had long-running systems before, very long-running systems. Is long life a big target of Nintendo, and so the Switch is likely to follow in these consoles' venerable footsteps? Before we go on, let's test that theory by looking critically at the life cycles of Nintendo's 3 longest-lived systems. I have to say, what I found was not what I was expecting. For ease of reference, we're defining a console's life as the period until a successor entered the scene, not until games stopped being produced. I know Just Dance fans may feel aggrieved, but hopefully this makes sense to most people. So, Nintendo's first and one of its longest lived systems was the original Famicom or Nintendo Entertainment System. From July 1983 when it first launched in Japan to November 1990 when the Super Famicom superseded it, the machine had an incredibly healthy life and of course gave us so many of the franchises we know and love today, including Super Mario Bros., Zelda and Metroid. In April 1989, the Game Boy rocketed off Nintendo's assembly lines and into the lives of gamers in Japan and later the world. It was the little machine that could, and although there were many variants, different colours, pocket editions, even an adapter to play on the SNES, the first true technological step forward was the Game Boy Color in November of 1988. 9 years and 7 months. And since Nintendo often liked to classify the Game Boy Color as an iteration of the prior console rather than a true generational leap, you could argue that the Game Boy wasn't truly replaced on the market until the Game Boy Advance on the 21st of March 2001, a month shy of a 12-year life cycle. Nintendo rode high again with the Nintendo DS, scraping the ceiling with a staggering 154 million sales. The DS launched in November of 2006 and had, on paper at least, a 7-year life cycle. Actually though, the DS life, while by all means impressive, was only really a little over 6 years, with the advent of the 3DS in February of 2011 ending the era. The 3DS was also a long-lived console. If you take Switch's release and its end date, it had just over 6 years in the sun. So it looks like Nintendo's been here before with their long-running systems, right? Actually, no. First, let's look at the NES. It's true that it did have a long life, and Nintendo were happy to keep it going, but there are several extenuating factors to consider. It had a relatively slow launch, with a product recall early on in its Japanese release cycle. After that, it was over 2 years before it reached the American market, over 3 years before it reached Europe, and longer still for much of the rest of the world. The growth of the NES was prodigious, but gradual. And yet, in September 1987, less than 2 years after Super Mario Bros. Changed gaming forever, barely 18 months after the first Zelda, and just 13 months after the first Metroid, when the NES was on a commercial and creative high, Nintendo president of the time, Hiroshi Yamauchi, announced the successor. True, it would be 2 years before it released, but the writing was on the wall. You see, Nintendo of the 1980s was a very different marketplace. There was no Sony or Microsoft, no high-end, tech-led video games competitors. In those days, they needed to keep up to the cutting edge of technology, and in the late 80s, as Sega and others launched new 16-bit consoles, the NES was no longer cutting. 7 1/3 years later, Nintendo's flagship system is still a monumental achievement. But compared to Switch's simultaneous worldwide launch with Breath of the Wild on day one, and Mario Kart, Splatoon 2 and Mario Odyssey within the first 8 months, the Switch had a far more aggressive start than the NES ever did. But maybe the Switch is close to the Game Boy. 9 years and 7 months is absolutely wild. Here's the thing with the Game Boy though, it did have a successor of sorts. The Virtual Boy was developed by the same creator, Gunpei Yokoi, used similar dot matrix technology, and released in July 1995, 6 years and 3 months after the Game Boy. Although it was definitely in the tradition of experimental side systems rather than a sequel to the Game Boy directly, it's not difficult to imagine that, like the DS to the Game Boy Advance and the Switch to the 3DS, this side project could have graduated into the main product. Of course, it tanked badly. Shigeru Miyamoto and Satoru Iwata reflected on the Virtual Boy years later. They looked at it as a toy that would have sold not too many units and would have been a fun experiment. But Gunpei Yokoi was talking about something much more radical, selling millions of units, something much more in line with what we consider an actual mainline console from Nintendo. I remember seeing advertisements for it at the time in games magazines, and I didn't know what to make of it. It was interesting, alright, but I couldn't say it was exciting or must have, and then it disappeared. Of course, Game Boy had an unexpected renaissance only a few months later with the release of a certain pocket monster game you may have heard of. The genius of this was that because 2 players needed a link cable to join their games, you really needed 2 different consoles at once. Time was, if you had a Game Boy and a sibling, sharing was the name of the game. Now though, there was no excuse for parents. Children needed a console each if they were going to catch them all. Undoubtedly, the explosion of Pokemon games gave the Game Boy an unexpected second wind. But does this mean in retrospect the very long life of the Game Boy was just a mistake? I think there's a strong case that it was. With an ill-judged successor being quickly removed from the market and a surprise breakout game giving the console an unlikely second wind, Nintendo were given the time they needed to go back to the drawing board and figure out what to do. And the truth is, it shouldn't have been hard because everyone was saying the same thing. I was in the playgrounds of the 1990s and all the talk was of one thing and one thing only. When will there be a colour Game Boy? Colour Game Boy, Colour Game Boy, Colour Game Boy. The release of the Super Game Boy adapter for the SNES in 1994 only continued the tease, and it was a long tease. Constant rumours abound on the playgrounds of the 90s about how Nintendo would catch up with Sega, whose full colour Game Gear was a technical marvel let down only, but significantly, by the fact that it guzzled down a huge number of batteries in only 3 or 4 hours at a go, whereas a mere 2 batteries could keep you playing Game Boy games solidly for days. That long battery life was the Game Boy's great strength, and Nintendo waited patiently until the battery life delivered on the Game Boy Color. When, in a sense, we saw the good universe version of the Virtual Boy with the 3DS. A weird, technologically bold successor to the previous system, it stumbled at first, but did eventually take off. The gap from the Game Boy to Virtual Boy and the DS to 3DS was almost exactly identical. The 3DS was just 6 days slower. There were other pressures on the DS, not least that piracy was starting to become a major issue for the system, and new technology was needed. It's possible that the system was pushed to market sooner in response to this, explaining its somewhat underwhelming early games lineup. But it does feel like the plan for a successor would have been in place come what may. So even Nintendo's 3 longest-lived systems all call time on themselves in a similar period. NES could last longer due to its delayed rollout, Game Boy dodged the axe and found a new lease of life, and the DS cruised into the sunset still near the top of its game. But 6 and a bit years is really the cap for all of them. What really surprised me researching this was that I'd always seen these systems as unstoppable juggernauts that went on forever, but each of them was quite clearly mortal and there were exit plans for the consoles clear to see from an early point. What do we conclude from this? However successful the Switch is, however much we love it, however much Nintendo loves it, however big its margins, we would assume that their default plans would be to replace the Switch within the 6 to 7 year window, which would be by March of 2024 in other words. However, we also see that no console has a strict pattern, and particular circumstances play a huge role in changing the course of a console's lifespan. The same can definitely be said of the Switch. Evidence is strong that an upgraded mid-generation Switch model, what people call a Switch Pro, did at one point exist. Many credible people have talked about it, and although the rumours feed rumours, my expectation is fully that we will eventually, a decade or 2 from now, have some kind of confirmation, either via an interview or via some kind of information dump, that this thing really existed. The 3DS was the first to experiment with a mid-generation refresh with the new 3DS, but the concept in many ways goes back to the Game Boy Color. It changed one feature of the hardware, but not the fundamentals of its power, and in this way it could refresh the current generation while still being a part of the current generation, at least arguably. I think that precedent is going to be quite significant here. However, the fact that this console was developed but never launched leads to one important fact that I don't think I've seen anybody else talking about. If there was let's call it a Switch Pro for ease of reference, if there was a Switch Pro, then the games would have been developed with that in mind. Perhaps some of those games, more and more over time, especially from third parties, would have been eyeing exclusivity on the new model. This isn't something that 3DS did significantly, but there were a handful of new 3DS exclusives, and quite a number of games that have console-specific enhancements. The longer we go on, the sooner we are getting to games which were potentially created, at least at some point in their development, with a view to more heavily utilising what we'll call pro features. Is there a chance, for example, that the delay to Tears of the Kingdom was, at least in part, caused by the need to optimise it, to bring as many pro-exclusive features as possible back to the base game? And is there a body of Switch games that have been developed to exploit a more advanced game architecture? If so, it's possible that Nintendo will at some point be running out of games they can confidently push on their current model Switch, and will therefore need to start pushing upgraded hardware. Another consideration looking at past patterns of releases is the Switch itself. From the original console in March 2019, we had a 2.5-year wait before the launch of the Switch Lite and the second Switch model. Then, just over 2 years elapsed before the OLED. This pattern of 2 to 2.5 year windows puts the next console's most likely release window anywhere from October 2023 to April 2024, and almost exactly matches the 6 to 7 year pattern we found before. That's not to say that we can discount the possibilities of a longer life cycle. What are the arguments for Nintendo to keep the Switch going for as long as possible? Well, first of all, the fact that it's still selling. The February 2023 Nintendo financial report did notice some fall-off in the sales of both consoles and evergreen games, but in some respects the tailing off of evergreen sales represents an opportunity for Nintendo to push out some of their slightly less well-known franchises and build new audiences off the very large Switch install base. Also, the older hardware is, the better its margins become. There's also the issues of supply and demand of chips. The pandemic-induced chip shortage doubtless affected plans, as supplying enough versions of even the existing models of Switch to meet demands became tricky at times. Now though, there's a chip glut, and Nintendo has the potential to be able to capitalise on this if they're able to make enough product. This is the old law of economies of scale. The more chips they make, the cheaper they will be, and therefore the better their margins. If they time their next release right to get a big groundswell of demand, this could be a very profitable time for them. So far in this video I haven't talked about specific leaks, such as the February 2024 purported leak revealing information about the Pokemon Scarlet and Violet DLC, which tangentially hinted at new hardware. Leaks and rumours are great fun, and we'll explore them on this channel as and when they crop up, but to me forecasting needs to be based on provable evidence, and there's simply no way to reliably fact check the validity of this person. Granted, they do appear to have had reliable information, but even if they are genuine insiders, the very fact that they're sharing information that they shouldn't suggests that they are, at least a little bit, untrustworthy, maybe a bit attention-seeking, and at worst, just flat-out liars. A little embellishment to make a tasty morsel all the more delicious would hardly be a new recipe for leakers. All this said, it does sound credible, but it doesn't significantly affect the deliberations here. Okay then, it's time to put a forecast to hard numbers. We've done the research. Let's make a prediction that you can hold the channel accountable for. So we're going to rank some questions from very low to very high possibility of happening, where very low means there's about a 10% chance and very high is about a 90% chance. Let's start broad. Will there be a Nintendo Switch successor console before the end of the 2024 to 2025 financial year, i.e. by the end of March 2025? I would say the chances here are very high. The Switch is an old technology, and the third-party pressure will eventually come to bear on Nintendo if nothing else does. Second consideration. Will there be a Nintendo Switch successor console before the end of the 2023 to 24 financial year, i.e. by the end of March 2024? This is less certain, and there are all sorts of delays that could affect things. I think on the current trajectory the chances are pretty good, maybe not by March, but maybe by April or May. But Nintendo is famously cautious, and if they can, they will push things back and back until they're quite ready. Just ask any Zelda fan. Therefore, I'm saying this is a medium chance at the current time. However, one more question. Will there be any new Nintendo Switch hardware before the end of the 2023 to 2024 financial year? I rate this chance as actually reasonably high. Wait, what? Nintendo hardware that's not a direct sequel system? Is this possible? I think yes, and some of the possibilities might really blow your mind. Next week, in part 2 of this Nintendo Forecast Deep Dive, we'll explore the wacky world of Nintendo's console iterations, how some of the company's strangest and most daring ideas come in this stage of a console's life cycle, and whether Nintendo could give the Switch a whole new lease of life before they even release a successor. If you enjoy Nintendo Forecast, I really encourage you to put your own views in the comments below. The more different measurable predictions we get, the more accurate we can all become. Please also put a like on our video and help boost the signal and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching.